My coworker spent 3 years harassing me for being a single em and locked my daughter in a dark closet. I got her arrested. I became a single mom at 26, not because I had planned to do everything alone, but because life rarely follows the neat outlines people imagine for you. By the time this story began, my daughter Sophie was 5, bright-eyed, curious, and still convinced the world was mostly a safe place. I worked as an account manager at a mid-sized marketing firm, a job I had held for 3 solid years. I was good at it. I met deadlines, kept client happy, and carried more accounts than most people on my team. My personal life never interfered with my performance, at least not until someone decided it should. That someone was Lindsay. She joined our department a little over 3 years into my tenure. From the first week, she made it clear she had strong opinions about mothers in the workplace. Lindsay was married, child-free, and wore her lifestyle like a badge of moral superiority. She talked often about how she and her husband prioritized freedom and ambition, words that always seemed carefully aimed in my direction. When she learned I was a single parent, something in her demeanor shifted. The smiles became thinner. The comments became sharper. It started subtly. When I packed up at 5 o'clock to pick Sophie up from daycare, something I'd done consistently since long before Lindsay arrived, she'd sigh loudly or glance at her watch. Sometimes she'd mutter things like, "Must be nice to leave early every day." I didn't leave early. I left on time. But she repeated it often enough that other people began to notice. During my first presentation after she joined, I was walking a client through a campaign proposal I had built from scratch. Halfway through, Lindsay interrupted me with a tight smile and asked if I'd actually prepared the deck myself or if I'd been too busy with mom stuff. The room went quiet. Our manager, Aaron, let out an awkward laugh and quickly moved things along. No one corrected her. No one told her that comment was inappropriate. I felt my face burn, but I finished the presentation anyway. The client loved it. That didn't stop her. Over the next few months, Lindsay began planting doubts wherever she could. She told clients, without including me, that I might be unavailable for certain projects because of childcare unpredictability. This was untrue. I had never missed a deadline, never dropped a call, never failed to deliver. Still, those whispers followed me. She scheduled meetings at 4:45 p.m., knowing full well I had to leave by 5. When I asked if I could join remotely for the last 15 minutes, she said showing up in person was about commitment. Once, Sophie got sick at school and I had to leave an hour early. That evening, Lindsay sent a company-wide email about how some team members relied on personal responsibilities as excuses for reduced productivity. She never used my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. The worst moment came during a quarterly review. Lindsay stood up and presented a spreadsheet she had created, color-coded, detailed, meticulous, tracking every time I arrived late or left early for anything related to my daughter. Doctor appointments, daycare pickups, emergencies. She framed it as a productivity analysis. Aaron praised her initiative. I sat there stunned, realizing someone had spent months monitoring my movements instead of doing their own work. After that, the hostility became more overt. She left articles on my desk about the psychological harm caused by working mothers. She told interns I had only been promoted to satisfy some invisible quota. She openly questioned why the company wasted money on benefits for dependents instead of rewarding employees without distractions. She spoke loudly about her luxurious, child-free vacations while staring directly at me. I complained. Multiple times. I documented everything and brought it to Aaron. Each time, he brushed it off. He told me Lindsay was direct and that I shouldn't take things personally. He suggested I be more flexible if I wanted to avoid tension. The message was clear. Adapting was my responsibility. By the time the company announced Take Your Child to Work Day, I was already exhausted. Still, Sophie was thrilled. She picked out her tiny backpack the night before and filled it with coloring books and crayons. She talked non-stop about seeing where I worked, about meeting my co-workers, about sitting at my desk like a grown-up. I debated not bringing her. Something in my gut told me it might be a mistake. But the company encouraged participation, and I didn't want Sophie to feel excluded. That morning, she sat quietly beside me, drawing pictures and whispering questions. She was well-behaved, careful, and proud. When Lindsay walked past, she stopped and looked at Sophie, then at me. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Doesn't it bother you," she asked my daughter, "that your mom makes you sit in an office instead of playing?" Sophie looked confused and asked what she meant. Lindsay leaned down and told her that being selfish meant choosing money over your child. I stepped in immediately and told her to stop. Lindsay shrugged and said she was just being honest. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just harassment anymore. I moved Sophie to the conference room during lunch so she could color quietly while I finished some work. The glass door allowed me to see her clearly. I told her I'd be right outside. I stepped away for what couldn't have been more than 2 minutes. When I came back, Sophie was gone. Her backpack sat on the table. Her coloring book lay open. The chair was empty. I called her name once. Then again. My heart began to race as I searched the office, the restrooms, the hallways. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard anything. Then, faintly, I heard knocking. It was coming from the far end of the hall. From the supply closet. And as I ran toward it, a terrifying thought formed in my mind, one I tried desperately to push away. Because I already knew exactly who had done this. The knocking grew louder the closer I got to the supply closet, but it still sounded small, fragile, like it might stop at any second. My chest felt tight, like the air had thickened around me. I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't move. The door was locked from the outside. I shouted my daughter's name, my voice breaking as panic surged through me. From inside, I heard Sophie sobbing, her cries muffled by the walls. Someone nearby finally noticed the commotion, but all I could think about was getting that door open. I don't even remember who found the master key. I just remember the door swinging open and Sophie collapsing into my arms, shaking so hard I could feel it through her clothes. She clung to me, her face buried against my neck, whispering that it was dark and she couldn't see anything. She said a woman told her there were toys inside and promised it would be quick. Then the door closed. Then there was only darkness. She had been screaming, she said, but no one came. I carried her back into the open office where people could see her. I wanted witnesses. I wanted someone, anyone, to finally take this seriously. Sophie's small body trembled against mine as she cried, and I felt something inside me shift from fear to fury. I didn't need proof yet. I didn't need footage. I already knew. Lindsay sat at her desk typing, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. I walked straight up to her and asked, loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, if she had locked my daughter in the supply closet. She looked up slowly, eyes widening, and said that was a horrible accusation. She insisted she hadn't left her desk. When Sophie lifted her head and pointed at her, saying, "That's the lady," Lindsay scoffed. She said children imagine things when they want attention. She suggested Sophie must have wandered in on her own and accidentally locked herself inside. Aaron appeared almost immediately, drawn by the raised voices. Lindsay's expression changed in an instant. Tears welled in her eyes as she said I was attacking her at work and creating a hostile environment. She claimed she felt unsafe. She said she might need to speak to HR about my behavior. Aaron turned to me and told me to take Sophie home and cool off. He said they would look into it. Look into it. I left because Sophie needed me, but I wasn't done. Not even close. That evening, after Sophie fell asleep, still clutching my arm like she was afraid I might disappear, I returned to the office building with a security officer. My hands shook as I asked him about access logs. The supply closet required a key card to open from the outside. The system recorded every use. When he pulled up the log, my stomach dropped. Lindsay's card had been used twice within a 15-minute window. Once when Sophie vanished. Once just before I found her. Then we watched the hallway footage. The video showed Lindsay stopping in front of the conference room. She bent down to Sophie's level and spoke to her for a moment. Sophie smiled and stood up. Lindsay took her hand and led her down the hall. She swiped her card, opened the supply closet, gestured inside, and the second my child stepped forward, Lindsay shut the door and walked away without looking back. The timestamps matched perfectly. The security guard burned copies of the footage immediately. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard it felt painful. There was no misunderstanding. No accident. This was deliberate. I called the police from the lobby, my voice trembling as I explained that someone had locked my 5-year-old child in a dark closet at my workplace. Officers arrived within half an hour. They watched the footage in silence. I could see their expressions harden as the video played. One of them looked at me and said the words I needed to hear: criminal confinement. Child endangerment. They asked if I wanted to press charges. I didn't hesitate. They took Lindsay into custody that night. I sat in the lobby with Sophie asleep against my shoulder when the elevator doors opened and the officers walked her out in handcuffs. Lindsay screamed that I was lying, that I was ruining her life, that this was all a misunderstanding. People stared. Phones came out. The doors closed behind her, and she was gone. Aaron showed up moments later, frantic and pale. I showed him the footage on my phone. He watched the entire thing, speechless. When he tried to offer excuses, I told him there was nothing to explain. I told him this didn't start today. I told him he had ignored 3 years of warnings. The next morning, a detective called and asked me to come in with any evidence of prior harassment. I spent hours gathering emails, messages, notes, and that spreadsheet Lindsay had created. Sitting in the interview room, I laid everything out: the comments, the meetings scheduled late on purpose, the constant undermining. The detective listened carefully and told me this showed a clear pattern. This wasn't an isolated act. It was escalation. When HR called me later that day requesting a meeting, I told them I would be bringing legal representation. The silence on the line said more than words ever could. What happened to Sophie was already irreversible. But the consequences were only just beginning. The HR meeting was scheduled for the next morning, less than 24 hours after Lindsay was taken away in handcuffs. I barely slept that night. Sophie whimpered in her sleep, jolting awake every hour, clutching my shirt like she was afraid the dark would swallow her again. Each time I soothed her back to sleep, my anger hardened into something colder and sharper. This was no longer just about workplace harassment. This was about what happens when warnings are ignored long enough for someone to get hurt. I didn't have a lawyer yet. When I told HR I would bring one, it was instinct more than preparation. As soon as I hung up, I called my friend Lisa, someone I'd known since college. She was an attorney, corporate contracts, not criminal law, but when I told her what had happened, she didn't hesitate. She said she would come with me. She said she wasn't going to let a company try to bury something this serious. The conference room felt smaller than usual when we walked in. The HR representative sat at one end of the table with a laptop open and a thick folder in front of her. I recognized the folder immediately. It was my file. Lisa introduced herself as my legal representation, and the shift in the room was immediate. The HR woman's posture stiffened. Her voice grew careful. She asked me to describe what happened on Take Your Child to Work Day. I told the story slowly, deliberately, starting from the moment Sophie walked in with her little backpack. I talked about moving her to the conference room, about stepping away for 2 minutes, about finding her gone. When I described hearing her cry from behind the locked door, my voice cracked despite my efforts to stay composed. Lisa slid a glass of water toward me, but I kept going. When I finished, the HR representative said the company was conducting an internal investigation and took the situation very seriously. Lisa leaned forward and asked how seriously the company had taken my complaints over the last 3 years. She asked why documented harassment had been allowed to continue unchecked. She asked why my manager had praised someone for tracking my parenting-related absences. The HR woman didn't have good answers. She admitted they had records of my previous complaints. Multiple ones. She said management had reviewed them and determined they didn't rise to the level of disciplinary action. Lisa asked if locking a child in a closet qualified. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. HR offered me paid leave and assured me the company would cover therapy costs for Sophie. Lisa then presented a written agreement she had prepared the night before: non-retaliation, job protection, and full cooperation with any legal proceedings. The HR woman said their legal team would need to review it, but she didn't push back. Not once. 3 days later, Lindsay appeared in court for her arraignment. I sat in the back row, my hands clenched in my lap, listening as her lawyer argued that she never intended harm, that she hadn't realized the door locked automatically. The prosecutor countered with key card logs and security footage. The judge set bail and scheduled a preliminary hearing. Watching Lindsay stand there in an orange jumpsuit felt surreal. This was the same woman who once lectured me about professionalism. The news broke 2 days later. Someone leaked the police report, and a local station ran a segment on workplace harassment that escalated into child endangerment. They showed the exterior of our office building and named the company. My phone exploded with messages from co-workers, former co-workers, and people I barely knew. Some expressed shock. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. That night, 3 women reached out to me privately. All of them had worked with Lindsay. All of them had children. Each told a different version of the same story. Comments about being unreliable, meetings scheduled late on purpose, subtle punishments disguised as expectations. Every one of them had left the company within a year. None had filed formal complaints because they'd watched mine go nowhere. The internal investigation lasted 2 weeks. I was interviewed twice. Others were interviewed too. Patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed. The receptionist confirmed overhearing Lindsay's comments almost daily. Interns admitted Lindsay had spoken openly about mothers not belonging in leadership. The spreadsheet resurfaced as evidence, Not of productivity, but of obsession. Aaron was fired on a Friday afternoon. The company email was brief and carefully worded. Failure to maintain a safe work environment. Mandatory management training. Policy changes. It didn't mention Sophie. It didn't mention Lindsay. But everyone understood what had finally forced their hand. In the middle of all this, Sophie started therapy. She stopped sleeping alone. She panicked if I left the room. The therapist explained she was experiencing acute stress reactions, nightmares, separation anxiety, fear of enclosed spaces. Recovery would take time. Weeks, maybe months. The company paid every bill without argument. A few weeks later, Lisa called me with news. The prosecutor was offering a plea deal. Probation. Mandatory counseling. A permanent restraining order keeping Lindsay away from Sophie and me. No trial. No testimony from my daughter. The alternative was taking it to court. I spent days agonizing over the decision. Part of me wanted Lindsay to face the harshest punishment possible. Another part couldn't bear the thought of Sophie reliving that moment in a courtroom. In the end, protecting my child mattered more than vengeance. I agreed to the deal. Lindsay pleaded guilty. The judge added community service and warned her that violating the restraining order would send her straight to jail. I watched her read a scripted apology that sounded hollow and rehearsed. There was no eye contact. No real remorse. 6 weeks later, the company settled with me. They compensated me for the years of harassment. Covered all legal fees. Guaranteed my position and provided a strong reference. I could have walked away and never looked back. Instead, I stayed. They promoted me. Moved me to a new team. Gave me a manager who understood what it meant to balance work and parenthood. Slowly, things began to stabilize. But healing isn't linear. Just when life started to feel normal again, the phone rang one Tuesday morning, and the voice on the other end told me Lindsay had been seen somewhere she absolutely should not have been. The call came from Sophie's daycare just after 9 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was in the middle of reviewing a client brief when my phone lit up with the director's name. Something in my chest tightened before I even answered. Her voice was calm, but strained in the way people sound when they're trying very hard not to alarm you. She told me Lindsay had shown up at the daycare. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced through the possibilities. Mistaken identity, outdated information, some horrible misunderstanding. Then the director explained that there was no confusion. They recognized Lindsay immediately from the photo I had provided when the restraining order was issued. She had walked in confidently, asked for Sophie by name, and said she wanted to apologize. The staff did exactly what they were supposed to do. They told Lindsay she was not allowed on the premises and needed to leave immediately or they would contact the police. Lindsay didn't leave. She went back to her car and parked across from the playground, sitting there and watching the children through the fence. The director moved all the kids inside and locked the doors while another staff member called 911. Sophie never saw her. That was the director's first reassurance. Sophie was safe inside, playing with blocks, unaware of how close danger had come. I thanked her over and over, my hand shaking so badly I had to sit down on the floor beside my desk. The police arrived within minutes. Lindsay was still in her car when they approached. She stepped out and started crying, telling them she only wanted to make things right. The officers checked the restraining order in their system, told her she was in violation of a court order, and placed her under arrest. She didn't resist. She just kept saying it wasn't fair, that she had changed, that she deserved closure. I spent the rest of the morning in a fog. The prosecutor called me that afternoon and explained what would happen next. Violating a restraining order, especially one involving a child, was taken very seriously. A hearing was scheduled for the following week. He asked if I wanted to provide a victim impact statement. This time, I didn't hesitate. I said yes. At the hearing, Lindsay looked nothing like the polished professional who once strutted through the office. Her hair was unwashed. Her shoulders slumped. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was remorseful and only wanted to apologize. The judge cut him off sharply. He said remorse didn't excuse violating a court order. He said the order existed to protect a child who had already been traumatized. He sentenced Lindsay to 60 days in jail. She broke down sobbing as the bailiff led her away. I felt something close to relief. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the quiet release of knowing she couldn't hurt my daughter again. Not for a while, at least. In the weeks that followed, the company reached out to me again, but this time, not with damage control. They wanted my input. HR and 2 senior executives asked if I would meet with them to help redesign their harassment policies. They admitted, plainly, that they had failed. That warning signs had been missed. That my complaint should have been taken seriously long before a child was ever involved. I agreed to help, but on my terms. We spent hours reviewing what had gone wrong. I explained how subtle discrimination often hides behind professionalism. How Lindsay's behavior escalated because no one stopped it early. How Aaron's dismissal of my concerns sent a message that harassment was tolerated if it was framed as productivity. New policies were drafted. Mandatory reporting timelines. Multiple channels for complaints. Training for managers on recognizing bias against working parents. The company stopped scheduling critical meetings after 4:30. Flexible scheduling became formal policy instead of an unspoken privilege. I led the first manager training myself. Standing in that room, telling my story, not the dramatic parts, but the small, ignored moments, I watched faces change. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked ashamed. Others looked genuinely determined to do better. At home, healing came more slowly. Sophie's therapy sessions became part of our weekly routine. At first, she barely spoke. She clung to me in the waiting room, her eyes darting toward every closed door. Over time, she started expressing her fear through drawings and play. She talked about the dark room. About feeling tricked. About screaming and thinking no one was coming. The nightmares faded gradually. She still slept in my bed most nights, but she laughed more during the day. She started trusting that when I left the room, I would come back. Her therapist said progress didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning that the danger was over. Work changed too. I was promoted to senior account manager and moved to a different floor with a new team. My new manager had kids of her own and never questioned my schedule. She judged my performance by results, not by how late I stayed. I landed 2 major clients within 6 months and was publicly recognized for my work. Life found a rhythm again. Nearly a year later, Sophie started kindergarten. She walked into her classroom without fear, barely glancing back at me. Her teacher said she was confident, kind, and quick to make friends. At home, she slept in her own bed and talked about the closet incident like it was something distant, still real, but no longer consuming. One afternoon, as we sat on the couch reading together, Sophie looked up at me and said, "The mean lady can't hurt me anymore, right?" I told her no. I promised her she was safe. And for the first time since that day at the office, I truly believed it. For a while after Lindsay was taken away, life felt cautiously calm, like the quiet that settles after a storm. I didn't trust it at first. Trauma teaches you to stay alert, to expect the next blow even when everything appears peaceful. Still, day by day, Sophie smiled more. She laughed without hesitation. She started sleeping through the night. And slowly, I began to exhale. The company followed through on its promises. The new policies weren't just words in an email, they were enforced. Managers were trained. Complaints were documented and investigated quickly. Working parents were openly supported instead of quietly judged. I noticed the change not just in meetings or schedules, but in the way people spoke. The tone had shifted. I was asked to sit in on interviews for a new manager role. HR said my perspective mattered. That phrase stayed with me. For 3 years, my perspective had been inconvenient. Now it was valuable. Sophie's therapist warned me that progress didn't mean closure. Trauma could resurface unexpectedly. Birthdays, new environments, even small reminders could trigger fear. She told me to watch for signs: clinginess, regression, sudden anxiety. I nodded, thinking we had already faced the worst. I was wrong. One evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she asked if jail meant the mean lady couldn't get out. I told her Lindsay couldn't come near us and that people were making sure of it. Sophie listened carefully, then asked what would happen when the jail time ended. That question followed me long after she fell asleep. A week later, I received a call from Lisa. Her voice was serious. She told me Lindsay's lawyer had reached out again, not to negotiate, not to apologize, but to ask about modifying the restraining order in the future. The request hadn't been filed yet, but the intention was clear. Lindsay wanted reduced restrictions once a sentence ended. The thought made my stomach turn. Lisa reassured me that any modification would require judge's approval and evidence that Lindsay posed no ongoing risk. But the idea that this wasn't over, that it could resurface months or years later, was unsettling. Safety, I realized, wasn't a single moment. It was something you defended continuously. At work, my name came up during succession planning. A director-level role was opening, and my manager encouraged me to apply. She said my performance, leadership during policy reform, and client success made me a strong candidate. I almost laughed at the contrast. Not long ago, someone argued I didn't belong in the workplace at all. The interview process was intense. Panel discussions, strategy presentations, questions about leadership philosophy. When asked how I handled conflict, I didn't give a rehearsed answer. I told the truth. I talked about what happens when people stay silent, about the cost of ignoring harm until it becomes irreversible. The room was quiet when I finished. No one interrupted. At home, Sophie started school projects about people who keep us safe. She drew pictures of teachers, firefighters, and, unexpectedly, me. When I asked why, she said it was because I found her and made the scary lady go away. I hugged her so tightly she laughed and told me I was squeezing too hard. The court date for Lindsay's violation sentencing came and went. 60 days turned into 60 nights where Sophie slept peacefully without fear of footsteps or locked doors. When I marked the end of her sentence on my calendar, I felt conflicted. Relief mixed with unease. Justice had been served, but vigilance remained necessary. Lisa helped me prepare a statement for any future hearings. She told me being proactive was a form of protection. I learned quickly that advocacy didn't end when headlines faded. The company invited me to speak at an internal town hall about workplace culture. Standing on that stage, I looked out at rows of faces, some familiar, some new. I didn't recount the entire story. I didn't need to. I spoke about listening. About believing people when they say something is wrong. About how power, when unchecked, becomes dangerous. Afterward, several employees approached me quietly. Parents. Caregivers. People who had felt invisible. They thanked me for speaking up. One woman said she had been considering quitting because of similar treatment and now felt hopeful. That moment mattered more than any title. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived at my home. It was addressed to me in careful handwriting. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was an apology. Lindsay wrote that she had been doing a lot of thinking. That therapy had helped her understand her anger. That she regretted what she had done and hoped I could forgive her someday. She said she wasn't asking for contact, just closure. My hands trembled as I read it. The restraining order prohibited direct contact. Lisa confirmed that the letter technically violated its spirit, if not its letter. We documented it. Filed it away. Prepared, just in case. I didn't respond. That night, I watched Sophie sleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something owed. Safety came first. Always. The next morning, I received an email from HR. The director role had been approved. They wanted me to start the following month. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop. Not because I doubted myself, but because I finally understood how far we had come. Still, one question lingered. What happens when someone who believes they've changed decides they deserve access again? The director role started quietly. No announcement. No celebration. Just a calendar invite, a new office, and the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. I welcomed it. After everything that had happened, structure felt grounding. Purpose felt steady. Sophie adjusted to our new routine better than I expected. Kindergarten mornings were filled with mismatched socks and rushed breakfasts, but she walked into school smiling, backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her teacher sent notes home about how kind she was, how she helped other kids when they felt scared. Every time I read one, my throat tightened. Healing doesn't erase memory. It teaches it where to live. A month into my new role, Lisa called again. This time, her voice was calm but firm. Lindsay had formally filed a request with the court asking to modify the restraining order once her sentence ended. She wanted it reduced to no direct contact, arguing that full-distance restrictions were unnecessary now that she had completed therapy and jail time. I felt something cold spread through my chest. Lisa explained the process. There would be a hearing. Evidence would be reviewed. I would have the opportunity to speak. Sophie would not be required to appear. The judge would decide whether Lindsay posed an ongoing risk. I agreed to attend. The week before the hearing, Sophie had a nightmare for the first time in months. She woke up crying, saying she dreamed she was trapped again and couldn't find me. I held her until morning, my jaw clenched with quiet fury. Change, I realized, wasn't measured by apologies or therapy notes. It was measured by impact. The courtroom felt smaller than I remembered. Lindsay sat at the defense table, looking healthier than the last time I'd seen her. Her posture was straighter. Her expression practiced. When she glanced at me, there was something almost expectant in her eyes, like she believed this was a formality. Her lawyer spoke first. He talked about rehabilitation, personal growth, lessons learned. He described Lindsay as someone who had made a terrible mistake but had since taken responsibility. He argued that the restraining order prevented her from moving forward fully and that reducing it would help her reintegrate into society. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, my hands steady despite the pounding in my chest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth. I spoke about Sophie's nightmares. About the week she wouldn't let me out of her sight. About how a single act, one calculated decision, had altered a child's sense of safety. I reminded the court that Lindsay didn't just violate boundaries once. She escalated for years. She ignored authority. She violated a restraining order by going to a daycare. I said that rehabilitation mattered, but so did accountability. And accountability meant distance. The judge listened without interruption. When Lindsay was asked to speak, she read from prepared notes. She said she was sorry again. She said she had learned coping skills. She said she understood why I was afraid but hoped I could see she was no longer the same person. The judge folded his hands and leaned forward. He said the purpose of a restraining order wasn't punishment, it was protection. He said that while growth was commendable, the responsibility to feel safe did not belong to the victim. He denied the request in full. The restraining order would remain unchanged. Lindsay's shoulders slumped. For the first time, she looked genuinely defeated. Outside the courthouse, I breathed deeply, feeling something loosen inside me. Not triumph. Not closure. Something quieter. Finality. At work, my team grew. I mentored 2 new managers, both parents, helping them navigate leadership without sacrificing their families. The culture we'd worked so hard to build held firm. Complaints were addressed quickly. Boundaries were respected. Sophie stopped therapy at the end of the school year. Her therapist said she had processed the trauma in a healthy way and showed resilience beyond her age. Sophie celebrated by insisting we get ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon, just because we could. That summer, we went to the zoo. Sophie ran ahead, fearless, pointing excitedly at everything. Watching her, I realized something important. The story didn't belong to Lindsay anymore. It belonged to us. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sky fade into dusk, Sophie asked why some people were mean even when they didn't need to be. I told her some people confuse control with strength. I told her real strength was choosing kindness when you had power. She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to drawing with sidewalk chalk. Later that night, I checked my email one last time. There was a message from the CEO. He thanked me for staying when it would have been easier to leave. He said the company was better because of what I helped change. He told me leadership wasn't about authority. It was about courage. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights. We were safe. We were stable. And for the first time since that conference room door closed behind my daughter, I knew, without doubt, that this chapter was ending on our terms. Time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing what mattered. By the time the court denied Lindsay's request to modify the restraining order, our lives had already begun settling into something that felt steady and real. Not perfect. Not untouched. But safe. And safety, I learned, was the foundation everything else rested on. Sophie finished kindergarten with a crooked smile and a backpack full of artwork. Her teacher told me she was empathetic beyond her years, the kind of child who noticed when someone else felt scared or left out. I saw it too, in the way she offered her hand to nervous classmates, in the way she spoke gently to younger kids on the playground. Trauma hadn't hardened her. It had deepened her compassion. At home, the memories faded into context instead of control. The closet incident became something that happened once, not something that defined her every day. Sophie slept through the night in her own bed. She closed doors without fear. She laughed freely in dark movie theaters and hid during games without panic. These small victories meant everything. At work, my director role came with long meetings and heavier decisions, but it also came with influence. I used it carefully. When new parents joined the company, I made sure they knew flexibility wasn't a favor, it was policy. When complaints came in, I followed up personally. Silence had nearly cost a child her sense of safety. I refused to let it happen again. The company continued evolving. What started as damage control became genuine cultural change. Employee surveys reflected higher trust in management. Retention among working parents improved. Other departments began adopting our policies. Watching that shift felt meaningful in a way promotions never could. Occasionally, I was asked if I regretted staying. The answer was always no. Leaving would have meant escape. Staying meant transformation. Sophie and I developed rituals that grounded us: Friday night pizza on the living room floor, Saturday morning library visits, Sunday walks where she asked endless questions about the world. Sometimes she asked about fairness. Sometimes about bravery. Once, she asked if I was scared when I found her in the closet. I told her the truth. I said I was terrified, but I didn't stop. And neither did she. That summer, we took a short vacation to the coast. Nothing extravagant. Just a small hotel near the water. Sophie collected shells and named each one. At night, she fell asleep listening to the waves. Watching her there, peaceful and unaware of how close her world had once come to breaking, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what we became because we refused to look away. I never heard from Lindsay again. The restraining order remained in place. The court case became part of the public record and then, slowly, part of the past. She faded from our lives the way she should have from the beginning. Without access, without influence, without power. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything began, Sophie came home from school upset. Another child had said something unkind to her. I listened, expecting tears or anger. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Some people choose to be mean. I don't have to choose that." I didn't correct her. She had learned the lesson on her own. As for me, I learned that advocacy isn't loud by default. Sometimes it's persistent. Sometimes it's inconvenient. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. But when done right, it changes outcomes. It creates safety where there was none. Standing up didn't just protect my daughter. It reshaped a workplace. It exposed silence. It reminded people that boundaries matter. If there's one thing I wish others would take from this, it's this: when someone shows you who they are, believe them. But when someone tells you they're being harmed, believe them faster. Because ignoring cruelty doesn't make it disappear. It gives it room to grow. Sophie and I still talk about courage, usually in small moments, before a test, before a new experience, before something unknown. I tell her courage doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you move forward anyway. She nods, like it's obvious. And maybe to her, it is. Our story didn't end with revenge or applause. It ended with something better. Peace, safety, and a future that belonged to us.